Forget this. Yep. So that's it. I think, Doug, you have the scene.
Okay, over to me, huh? Great. Okay, I'll try and fire up my presentation screen. I'm sorry you're going to lose the wonder of being able to stare at my face and get slides. And I think we're going to, or at least hopefully Corrado is going to be watching for questions and might shout them out to me if he thinks that they're really relevant to bring up at the time. Because I'm happy to try and take them during it. I'm guessing I'm going to answer most questions during the presentation, probably later on in it. But it's good to know what they are so that I can think about it as I'm going. So let's try sharing. And I think it's this one. Okay. Is everyone getting a slide with the title on it?
Yes.
Yep, great. Cool. Okay, so welcome to, actually I'm just gonna get rid of this if I can. That's better. Because I am gonna need that other tab. So cool. Welcome to my presentation on fundamental principles of organizational design. But I guess the fundamental principles that I've decided to take you through are part of a thought model that I've been putting together over the last sort of 10 years personally. And I'm going to mention all sorts of principles that I've kind of gathered together rather than a particular version from a particular book or a particular framework. And hopefully I've thrown together some things that you'll find interesting. So quickly, just a bit of an intro to me. I've probably been I started commercially building software in 1990. So been around software for forever. And about 15 years ago, I both transitioned into becoming a technology manager and leading technology. Am I going to have to admit these people, by the way? Or Corrado, do I need to click those? You'll do it? Okay, great.
Go ahead.
Cool. And I also got introduced to Agile, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that journey. And then most recently, I stopped being in a permanent management position, and I've founded a small consultancy called The Adjacent, and we're really focused on trying to help other organizations be the best that they can be, help organizations be highly effective, and think about all the different ways in which they could evolve their organizations in the most intelligent ways. And what I guess everything about this design discussion is learnings that I've spotted over those 10 or 15 years of trying to understand and design my own teams and larger chunks of organizations, and then what we've been finding when we've been working with people through our consultancy. I'm also an InfoQ.com editor, mostly on culture and methods, and I'm also an accreditor for the International Consortium for Agile for courses and instruction in that area. So that's me. And so here's quickly the kind of order in which I'm going to go through things. I'm going to just tell you a little bit more about my background and where I came to some of this design thinking from. I'm going to look at evidence collecting and how we can actually figure out what we should do when we're looking at organizational design. I'm going to try and simplify that into a model, which is something I've been using over the last sort of 6 or 7 years, maybe a little bit longer than that, back to New Zealand, so 8 years now. Then I'm going to look a little bit at how do we actually use that model? How do we act in complexity? How do we use it to do diagnosis? How do we use it to prioritize work? And how do we use it to design interventions? And all of that within the kind of context of you as a leader. And that means not just a manager, but anyone who's leading some part of an organization or is influencing an organization, what kind of things you should be looking out for and what kind of things you might be able to do about it. So a really quick summary of the journey that took me here is back in my first managerial role, 2004, 2005, Ministry of Social Development. I headed software development there, and I got first introduced to Agile, and it was mostly feature-driven development and Scrum, and very, very focused on developers and architecture. And so it worked brilliantly for the few years I was there, but we very quickly started to hit boundaries, mostly boundaries of the value stream going outside of our teams, and boundaries of, I guess, how could we be more efficient at this? Because Scrum only gave us so much to go on. So when I moved to head of software at the Met Service in New Zealand, I brought in sort of more feature squads to allow more complexity in the way that we divided our teams across demand. And I also worked on TDD and BDD to try and interact better with the testing silo that was sitting next to me. There was another functional silo, and with the product silo that was sitting next to that. And also brought in a whole bunch of Kanban to try and look much more at efficiency within the teams. And then I jumped to the Bank of New Zealand, and there I started acting on the next level of constraints that I'd been hitting, which were how do we interact as a much bigger scaled group? And I actually got involved with Dean Leffingwell in some very, very early days of SAFe. Don't hold that against me if you're a lover or a hater of SAFe. I also started using DevOps techniques to bring in the infrastructure and ops people who were kind of under my remit there, because I was head of digital delivery. And I started looking at the culture and the complexity of bringing teams of people together and looking at our recruitment model. And then a few years later, I ended up at Ocado Technology, and I noticed there's a couple of faces here from that world. And there I was head of organizational effectiveness, and suddenly the remit was an additional scope around the edges. And I was having to worry about the design right the way through from HR and culture to portfolio management and forecasting across multiple different groups of feature teams, and worry about the localized efficiency inside teams. And so all of that led me to just kind of keep on adding knowledge and adding knowledge and adding knowledge. And finally, in 2018, I kind of stepped into the adjacent mode, into this consultancy mode, and was thinking, what do I call all of this organizational stuff and organizational design and organizational effectiveness? And I'd had a couple of key realizations over that time. One, and it's kind of an obvious realization, it's not about agility. All of this stuff around our agile world is not the end goal. That's kind of like a functional model or a practice model. It's about creating great organizations, and therefore we have to think about the macro pattern, the organizational design as a whole. And it's not about the practices that we get so obsessed about. It's not about story points and estimation and WIP limits and all of those kind of things. It's about alignment of leadership and systems and practices across the whole organization, and figuring out to make sure that there's lack of friction between those things. So I tried starting to catalog this, and I actually started probably, almost 10 years ago, starting to gather and catalog the information. But the key for me was that I needed to make sure it was stuff that actually had evidence and was research-based, and filter out all of the noise and the stuff that wasn't valuable, and all of the hearsay and the maybes and that kind of thing. So, and it eventually started to look like this. This is actually a snapshot from a few years ago. And now it's unreadable, even more unreadable than it is on this screen. But basically, I've now called this the data lake. And I started to chat with different leaders, particularly managers that I was managing, about this data lake of information. And Ulla was talking about books, and you can see there's a lot of book titles here, but there's also a lot of academic articles were included, and a lot of research articles, and a lot of websites and things and blogs. And I was trying to gather everything I could that I could actually go, yeah, that stuff's really based upon good evidential backing. But it scared everyone off. It was too much information. And often I'd sit down with a manager over the last sort of 5 or 10 years of my history, sit down with the manager I was meant to be coaching, and try and describe, oh, look, what should we talk about today? And they kind of want to run and hide in a corner. And so I realized I needed a model. So I had this change of tactics, started building a model on top of it. And the key from the model was that it had to make it really accessible, provide all of that organizational design knowledge in a way that people could use it for diagnostics, use it for prioritization, and use it for design guidance. And to caveat what you're about to see. All models are wrong, and this one's definitely wrong in places, and some are useful, and I really hope this one's more useful than it's not. And some of the proof of the model is that it's now been used in the assessment and diagnostics of multiple national, international governments. It's been used in places like Ocado, in the Bank of New Zealand with GDS, and in a bunch of small SMEs and startups. So hopefully it's had enough time to at least be giving more use than non-use. And the start of the model is this idea that there is a pile of what we call the ology layer, which is where all of the psychology, the sociology, the maths, and all the kind of fundamental theories that we can really, guarantee have got substance behind them, where all they lie. And then at the top of the model, there is all of these practices and frameworks that we're also familiar with, whether it be SAFe or Scrum or a framework like Wardley mapping, or a model for thinking about how to structure our organization like Zone to Win from Geoffrey Moore, even techniques like hackathons. And what I wanted was a layer in the middle, this organizational dynamics layer, that let us check which practices and frameworks matched nicely to the ologies and the principles and the theories that we could rely on at the bottom, and so that we could pick the right thing for the right place in our organization, and we could have some faith in it. And that organizational dynamics layer in the middle ended up looking like this, and I'm going to just quickly take you through what all the pieces of it are, and then we'll talk about how we can actually use it. So any organization has to have a direction. It has some commitments, some purpose and mission, and basically then we're trying to look for what makes that, or could make that organization most effective on that mission and journey. And what I found was, when I was scanning all of this information, there were kind of three really solid, broad pillars, I'm going to call them, of the model that emerged. And the first was, you had to get your organization and your culture right. And that's not going to be a surprise to any of you. So I'm going to kind of move on. But the key is, this is actually the one that actually most organizations seem to spend the least time in and spend the least effort on. And yet there's the most literature on. And we end up with a lot of organization and culture literature like Drive, and like Thinking Fast and Slow, and Peopleware, and Team of Teams and stuff, which is just all focused about how do we put teams of people together, how do we create communities, how do we create communication, and how do we deal with human beings. And obviously there's also stuff very much on the structuring of that organization around them. We've got Resilient Organizations here, fantastic book. Reinventing Organizations, the famous one, and we can obviously see all the stuff around teal or orange, and we can look at how we might categorize what our organization is, and lets us think about, as leaders or as influencers, what are we going to do, or have we got a model, have we got an overall vision of what our organization and culture should be and should look like, and have we looked into the pieces of it? The second pillar that really emerged was build the right thing, and that's a classic agile meme, so I'm sure you've all heard it before, but all the things that help us build the right product and service, make sure that that there's good service design behind it, that it's well user-centered, that we've thought about patterns for innovating, we've thought about patterns for designing, for understanding our user, and we've thought about how we might structure around services or products or customers and all of those things. And then the third pillar that came out was this pillar of efficiency and quality. But clearly, there's no point in being efficient at building the wrong thing, and there's no point at and you're not going to be able to be efficient if you've got the wrong team. So the organization and your team and your community have to come before your product, and before you make that an efficient model that you're going to run across that team. And efficiency covers classics like Theory of Constraints and the Phoenix Project, Principles of Product Development Flow, amazing book on all of the kinds of measurement in flow efficiency and queuing theory that you might want to hear, and right the way down to things like clean code and how could we write, how could we do our engineering more cleanly and more efficiently. But once I'd found these three pillars and kind of they'd emerged out of this pile of literature, then there were clearly three key influencing levers. And the first one here is leadership. And I'll talk about the order in which these things operate, but in a moment. But leadership was showing up in all of them. There was books on how to lead product, how to lead efficiency, and how to lead culture, and how to lead teams. And it was clearly a really, really important lever. If you didn't get it right, things were going to break down really, really quickly. And then the leadership was kind of the responsible agent within an organization, whether it was a leader as an influencer, as a coach, or as a manager, or as an individual as an architect or someone who's influencing an element of it. But their job was to create the right systems so that everyone in their tribe or their team or their organization understood what the constraints and the governance and the model was that organization was using as the basis for its thinking around its culture, its services, and its quality. And then finally, the teams hopefully would be empowered to emerge their own practices within the constraints of those systems. And we could look at hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different practices. And I've got a list of a few that will be in the slides that you can get later. But there are many, many in here. And this is where I find most of our time is spent talking in Agile. And I guess part of my campaign today, when we're doing organizational design, or we're thinking in more of an organizational design headset or headspace, is to get away from practices and think up the chain. So this gave us 9 dynamics where these levers met the 3 pillars. We end up with 9 boxes that we can go and look at, and we can diagnose, we can look at the priority of, and we can look at how we can intervene in them. So I'm going to do another quick scan of the kinds of things that did end up embedded inside this model, just so you had some scan, and maybe there's some books here or some ideas that you might want to take away and research. I'm not going to go into any of them in detail, but if you've got Q&A at the end, happy to chat about them then. But one is obviously Frederic Laloux's work on organizational models, but there's many more other works that you can look at on organizational models. But knowing whether or not you're planning on running some form of heterarchy or some form of democracy or hierarchy is going to matter a lot to the way that you can then do other elements of your organization. It's also worth looking at organizational portfolio life cycle patterns. Are you going to follow maybe a Simon Wardley mapping model of your organization divided into pioneers and settlers and town planners? Are you going to follow maybe the 3 horizons model? Are you going to be using Geoffrey Moore's zone to win and looking at his 4 transformation zones? And are you going to have a 10x group and a 1.1x group, or how are you going to structure your organization around the life cycle of the services and products that you're developing, and whether you've thought of this? How are your organizational systems going to support this? How is your HR going to work, and your finance going to work, and your innovation arm going to work? I'm just throwing up book titles here that you might want to write down, but again, you'll have the slides later to scan through. But these are just some of the ones that I find are really good value in looking at some of these elements, and one might resonate with you. It's worth looking at the efficiency of your value streams through your organization. And there's a whole bunch of books that cover this. But are you going to choose a flow efficiency model? Are you going to choose a utilization efficiency model? Are you going to be thinking theory of constraints or queuing theory or Little's law? And how are you going to monitor and manage and know that you've grown your productivity or your performance in your teams? How are you going to measure your organization? Obviously, Accelerate's come out reasonably recently, and a lot of people are talking about that with its talk about ways to measure your software teams, but it needs to be genericized out to your whole organization. If the way you measure your software teams and the delivery of your software is not aligned with the way you're measuring your whole organization and the way that your CEO and maybe the board are monitoring the progress of that organization, if they are colliding and creating friction, then things are going to go wrong. So are you going to be using failure demand and lead time and culture measures or statistical forecasting? And it's definitely worth having a good solid think about that. It's a kind of primary element of knowing you're achieving what you're trying to set out to in organizational design. what's the orientation of your organization? I'm meeting 5 key orientations which are getting quite popular in the literature. One being functional orientation, and that's the classic kind of old waterfall, if you will, in that you've got the testing group and the sales group and the marketing group and the development group. We've got product oriented, so that means that we're oriented around the specific items that we're delivering out to our customer. We've got service orientation, where we're orienting around a whole package with a customer. So it won't be just one product. It might be a package of products that create an entire interaction model and service with the customer. And we've also got customer orientation, which is and persona orientation, which are being talked about a lot recently, which are much more where you are striping your organization to the types of customer you have, not necessarily the services that you're providing them. And that's a really interesting way to look at your organization. And then we obviously can structure ourselves, and we can be making sure we're taking into account psychology. I'm sure you guys have seen these titles before, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about this later. And we can be worrying about our culture. Again, I'm sure you guys have seen these titles and thought about culture. We can think about leadership. Same again. We can be thinking about or we can be thinking about the kinds of organizational practices that we're going to use across our organization, and what effect is it going to have if we use systems thinking across our organization, or if we use Cynefin across our organization as a habit or a tool or a practice, or theory of constraints. And one of the places that's actually quite worthwhile going to look up the kinds of organizational practices that are starting to emerge, particularly in the software world, is actually InfoQ, where they run these emergent mappings every quarter of the kinds of things that are innovative at the moment, early adoption at the moment, early majority or late majority. They do this kind of Jeffrey Moore curve, crossing the chasm curve, and check whether or not things are surviving that chasm. And finally, here's just a spam of a bunch of other things, which will be in the slides for later. But again, when we're acting as designers, all of this stuff matters. What practices we use, what systems we use, and what leadership we create all matters in the way that our organization designs. So as I was going over these 10 years, I was spotting that there were a whole bunch of organizational design bad habits going on. And one of them that I've hopefully am providing some answers to is that now no one can have an excuse that we don't have enough evidence to find an evidence-based answer to any problem we have. But a lot of people were not using evidence-based ideas and were just doing whatever they felt happy with, whatever their manager had taught them, whatever they last used in a group, whatever they'd had one success with, or that they'd made up some neat new idea and tried it out as an experiment on their team. And what I was striving for was evidence-based, research-based kind of ideas. But other habits, which I'm going to kind of cover off now, is people were not working on seeing the whole, and they often got very focused on just their silo and didn't worry about the connectivity, their systems interactions with other silos. They weren't dealing with complexity, so they were thinking that we could treat everything as there's one simple right answer, and there's a good or a best practice, and we can guarantee that if we pick that thing, everything's just going to work. And so we're going to talk a bit about complexity and how to apply it. And people were definitely also not targeting the highest value thing. Often we were going and picking the easiest thing and acting in really low value places. So I want to talk about how we can use this model to help us out in that space. And so the primary part of that is designing our answers for complexity. And I think the right way to describe this is this idea of coherent evolution. So two bad ways in which people were interacting when we're trying to do a design was we were creating a really fragmented model on the left here, and we were we had 6 or 7 different organizational designers or agile coaches running around our organization, all doing disjoint little interventions in teams. In this team, we're going to have a bit of a go at a Kanban wall. In this team, we're going to do some limiting WIP. In this team, we're going to do some feedback training. In this team, we're going to, we're going to talk about quality or something and definition of done. And the problem often there was that if you're as a coach or a leader or a group of managers across a bunch of teams, and you're doing lots of disjoint things and you're not lining them up against a system, you're never sure whether you're actually creating a system as a group of leaders, or whether you're just fixing a symptom and then going to move on to the next symptom and then find it's reoccurred behind you. And it's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole, and everyone's running around doing disjointed things, and we're not actually trying to align something across our organization. And the other form tends to be the other end of the scale, where we, as an organization, the CEO says, we're all going to go agile, we're all going to go safe, or the CTO says that, and suddenly we do a big bet, but it's often based upon a single cookie cutter pattern, which is not contextualized to the teams, the people, the culture, and the organization that you're in. And I think that it's one of the key weaknesses of these big structured patterns that we're seeing out of the large consultancies, where they have a cookie cutter answer they can come in and give you in 6 weeks. So clearly, if an individual is as complex as, I don't know how many of you have read the book Behave, but Robert Sapolsky talks about the many ways in which, if we want to change ourselves, or if we want to try and help change the patterns of a person, and you're wanting to help them out as a coach, that if we only know neuroscience, then the only thing we know how to fix is maybe a bit of surgery to rewire a little bit of their brain, or maybe we can help them with some I don't know, electrode stimulation or something. But actually, that's only one fraction of the answer of the complexity of a human being. And if we then bring in hormones and psychology and sociology, the culture that they're within, how they're incentivized, and the community and the trust they have with the person that they're working with, it becomes so complex that we can never be sure that anything we do is going to have the outcome we expect. And if we're dealing with an organization of thousands of human beings potentially, then we get that complexity multiplied out many, many times over. And often we get the situation where we go, oh, I just want to straighten that pink rubber band across the middle of that ball. I just want to tweak it a little bit. Everything will be fine. And we straighten the rubber band a little bit, but we don't realize that we've just bent a blue one and an orange one and a green one, and all the other ones are starting to affect. And you can imagine if we tried to optimize one value stream through the network diagram on the right, and we took 2 points on the far edges of that network diagram and pulled them until the line across that organization was nice and straight. And by making that single line across that organization nice and straight, we would have bent many, many other parts of the system out of shape. And until we can, and so there's only really one way to deal with this, because if we start doing that, we're just going to create chaos. And so hopefully everyone has heard of Cynefin and uses Cynefin in their organizations as a sense-making tool to figure out which domain we're in. But if you're doing organizational design, you're almost always up in the complex domain. And we need to be making sure that we're using some form of probe, sense, respond, that we're doing an experimental, incremental understanding of our organization. And my model should hopefully help us do some of that. So, if we end up with this answer that is basically this idea of coherent evolution, where as we take a step forward, we're constantly questioning whether or not we're going towards our end journey marker, our long-term vision of our awesome organization. And we're constantly balancing this idea of the complexity of the structure of our internal organization. How is it put together, all of the people in it, what products we're creating, and all of the interactions of all of those very complex human beings, with the external complexity of the changing markets, the digital revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, COVID, and internationalization, and US elections and the like, and that we're constantly going to have to regularly going to have to check whether or not we're going in the right direction. And that means we have to have measures, and we have to do small experiments and recheck and recheck and recheck. And as Cynefin would say, we have to accelerate any good outcomes that are going in the right direction and dampen any that are going in the wrong direction. And hopefully That's really obvious complexity interaction for you. But if any of you haven't heard about that stuff, definitely get out there and start reading up on Cynefin and reading up on the complexity model for dealing with it. So the first part of that is being able to see how we're doing. So we have to use a diagnostic and we have to figure it out. So behind the model, I needed this repeatable structure and data, and I needed to be able to go and assess each of the 9 intersecting organizational dynamics and see whether or not they'd improved or got worse. And so I wrote with a team, I've written about 110 questions now, which is a lot, but basically it's about 10 or 15 questions per of one of the 9 boxes, which we can ask ourselves, and we can go and ask other people and interview them and figure out whether or not we're doing, badly through to amazing on those categorizations. And then we can start to get a bit of a heat map of where we're good and bad across our organization. And we can do that with experts doing these kind of interviewing models. And for each one of those questions, we're developing rubrics, and we've got some of the, quite a lot of the rubrics already. But so the idea is that we can look for, we can read a description of what the latest is in awesomeness in that space, and we can also get a description of what it would look like if we really were doing awful in that thing. And that way, we're not just coming up with a subjective score, we're actually got a description in which we can tie ourselves to, and we can look for where are we on that rubric, and we can then go, okay, what's the next maturity step up that rubric on all of those dimensions? And that can give us then a final heat map where we'd have these 3 columns and these 3 verticals with some red, some green, some yellow, some orange. And we can kind of go, okay, we've got all of this feedback from the people we've interviewed. Here's the evidence, here's the data, if you will, that this box is strong and that this box is weak. And now we can go, okay, we've now got some diagnostics and some data about where to go and intervene. But we've still got a problem in that we've got 3 red boxes here. Should we go and intervene in a red box? Or we've got 2 yellow boxes or we've got many yellow boxes. Should we intervene in those? Or should we even accelerate the green box? Should we be putting even more effort into that? And so we're going to talk about how we prioritize that in a sec. But in addition to doing like an interview style diagnostic, we can simply go out and ask our community where their greatest pain is. Where do they feel most impeded by? What are the issues that are getting in their way? And then we can categorize the issues and the pain points that they feed back to us. And we can go, are these, and see how they scatter across the 9 boxes. And you can see this is a very early version of the model here on the right. And there were actually 12 boxes in the model at this point. But fundamentally, what you can tell from this is that most people told us that there were issues with culture and organization and team dynamics and the human side of our organization. And actually build the right thing and build it right, people didn't really have many complaints or issues about. And that instantly gives us a direction over to that side, and we can start to look for how can we intervene to help that column out. But we still have a choice here of, are we going to intervene at leadership or system or process? Where are we going to put our next bet? So that's what we're going to talk about. Where can we place our next bet? And we hit the a term that I'm sure, again, many of you have heard before, but equifinality, that there are many, many paths to achieve the same outcome. So there's no right answer here. And I'm going to say that no right answer meme a lot over the next half of the presentation. But there are some implicit orderings that you can start to rely on a bit. And what we see is 2 main implicit orderings in organizations. One is that leadership tends to be the key influencer of systems, and systems tends to be the key influencer of practices. And that organization and culture normally comes and needs to be structured and strong so that you can have good, healthy products and services. And then you can worry about the efficiency and quality. The classic, you can't, there's no point in building the wrong thing right. So these 2 implicit orderings, the bottom green one is really obvious and often referred to in the agile world, but the blue one I see us disobeying all the time. what tends to happen is we go to practices because they're the most concrete place, and they're often where the symptoms appear, not the causes, but this is often where the symptoms appear in our organizations. And then we try and manipulate that practice, but we don't know whether or not it's actually now aligned or misaligned with the system above it, because we often don't ask that question. And then we find that the practice doesn't embed, or our teams now get into a grumpy argument with the product owners next door or with the manager of another silo, and we create friction points. So what we have to do is make sure, if we are going to manipulate on a practice which is at the lowest priority end of this trio, that it is at least aligned to what systems and leadership there is. Otherwise, we're going to create a fight in our organization. So this gives us a rough heat map idea across the 9 boxes, which is that organization culture first, product second, efficiency third, leadership first, systems second, practices third. And that means that we have this obvious want to interact and create organizational design change from the leadership of the culture and the organizational structure and the way we treat people, and move away from worrying about efficiency practices. And that roughly looks like this, that if we have, that's the top priority in the top corner, and then the orange one's next, and then the blue one's next. And it's not quite that simple, but it gives us an idea about where to go. But there is another way that this works, and this is where organizations tend to get things upside down, is that if we do decide to work on efficiency and practices, it's nice and easy, but it's only temporary and often fails. But if we do decide to work on the leadership area up in the top left-hand corner and in the organization and culture, it's now really hard, it's really long-term. And often that means that leaders of various forms resist going and working in those spaces, because it's often too hard to negotiate across the organization or implement, and it's a bit scary sometimes and potentially risky even. And so we then have to go back and remember the coherent evolution and doing micro changes. And we also have to think about the fact of what's the scope of the area that we can control, and what systems can we stay aligned with while still making an intelligent change. So some quick obvious mappings, but if we're worrying about story points in our teams, then we're worrying about efficiency practices in the bottom hand corner. We're worrying about the thing that determines how many points is committed to in a sprint, and not worrying about whether or not we have a highly effective team, and whether or not we have great feedback, and whether we have great collaboration and things. And so it's a low priority place to act. And yet we spend probably half of the internet arguments across the whole of the Agile community are about estimation and story points, or sometimes story breakdown. And this is a low priority place for us to be spending our time as organizational designers or coaches or influencers. This also starts to show up when we look at maybe what areas in the 9 dynamics Scrum affects, and it mostly affects bottom 4 corners with small touches on others. And so if we're going to implement Scrum successfully, we then have to worry about, is Scrum aligned with the other organizational structures around it? And I've seen a lot of Scrum implementations fail because they created so much friction that eventually they made everyone else around them grumpy, and they imploded on themselves. So it's not that it's not the right thing in those places, but if we're going to do some kind of organizational change, we need to really worry about, have we got this practice model aligned with the rest of the organization? Let's look at a couple of other ones. If we're going to worry about test automation, but we have a system in the organization where everyone is monitoring and registering the amount of developer utilization, and they're counting the amount of hours and the number of developers we have in the organization, and everyone just wants to hire more developers because that will make us go faster, and we're not worrying about all of the other functions around them, and let's maximize 100% utilization on developers, then those developers are going to be creating a nightmare for test automation, and no one's going to want the test automation because that's not good utilization of developer time. So if we have a system that's fighting with a practice that we want to institute, then we're going to have to figure out how to break that divide, and we're going to have to figure out how to untie that friction. Delivery dates is a classic as well. If you've got a product, head of product pushing for delivery dates on a particular product or service, and you're going, and on your wall of features to do or things to do is lots of test automation or lots of technical debt, that stuff is a efficiency practice. It's going to die to that higher ranked priority item. So we're going to have to figure out, how do we system align, or how do we go and have a talk with that piece of leadership? Another classic way that I'm seeing in a lot of organizations is we have sales incentives, and those sales incentives are an organizational incentivization. Therefore, they're part of the way our human community is set up. And if we've got teams that are trying to limit WIP, and we've got salespeople who are incentivized to sell as much as they possibly can sell and make as much money as they can possibly sell, then those two things are now instantly in friction, and you can guess which one's going to lose. So the guys that are really trying to limit their WIP are going to get told, no, just pull your head in and get on with that other bit of work. Or if we're really trying to do a great job of user research and UX design, that's going to be the first thing to go, because it's never going to compete with an incentivization for the sales group. Another classic that I'm seeing a lot of recently is OKRs. And if you have an OKR system going in, which again is a form of incentivization, it's effectively a form of performance management, even if its ultimate goal is to align the organization. And lots of individuals have got their OKRs, and yet we're trying to run a weighted shortest job first lean optimization on our product portfolio. And a developer picks up an item which is the right thing off the prioritization portfolio, because it's the next thing on the weighted shortest job first prioritization chart, but it competes with an OKR that he signed up to for this quarter, then the OKR is probably going to win. And so you're going to get developers going off and doing features that you wouldn't expect them to be doing, or doing project work that you wouldn't expect them to be doing, because of the competing nature of those two systems, and the one on the left is going to win. So if we're going to design something within all of this chaos, what do we have to think about? Well, we have to think about equifinality, as we've talked about, but we also have to think about multifinality. Every time we do something in a complex space, there are going to be multiple possible outcomes to that event, and we need to be ready for the accelerate and dampen a la Cynefin. And so that gives us it makes it almost essential that we do some kind of causal mapping. The classic analogy, I think, that helps a lot of people think about this is, if you've got knee pain, you don't instantly go, okay, I know exactly what that is. I know that exactly where that's happening in what's happening in my body. You're going to want to go and talk to a bunch of experts to find out whether or not it's something to do with your glutes or your IT band, or whether it is actually your knee or your kneecap. You're going to want to talk to a whole bunch of experts about how you might intervene, who are experts in, maybe you want to talk to someone who's a surgeon, maybe you want to talk to someone who's a PT, maybe you want to talk to a physio or an osteopath, or maybe you just need to take some painkillers and you just need to talk to your GP. But you're going to have to get a whole bunch of specialist information to have a look at this thing. And you're going to then have to, and those people are going to have to take into account all of the environmental factors around you. What are your goals? What's your level of discipline, your personality? How fit are you? Is it something you've been doing for a day or for 50 years? Yeah. And those things are going to come in. So we have to do the same for our organizations. We have to talk to experts in different areas. We have to bring a diverse team together to look at these organizational designs. And we have to make sure that we're considering all of the potential factors of that scenario. So we've got to make sure, because there's no right answer, that what we are doing is at least next adjacent for that organization, and it's coherent. So if someone's telling you they're going to take you from functional waterfall and jump you all the way to scaled agile, then those two things are not next adjacent. It's not a realistic jump. If you're going to move from hierarchical to learning organization overnight, then they're lying to you. And we need to make sure we don't do this to people and set invalid expectations in people's heads. If we, however, wanted to improve efficiency, should we maybe do a value stream and just pick one element of that value stream and do a coherent evolution of that next item, of the most important item in that value stream, and then recheck again with another probe? If we're going to improve efficiency, maybe we just need to learn about flow efficiency as a leadership team or as a coaching team. And we need to pick a value stream to try a small experiment on, and maybe we try some limiting of WIP, and maybe we try a pull system. But if we are going to do that thing, then we're going to have to look around and look at outside of us and do some systems thinking to figure out, do we need HR involved in this? Do we need finance involved in this? Do we need the PMO involved in this? Are the things that we're about to change going to make those people grumpy, are going to create friction with systems that those people have set up? So one of the another example that we see a lot at the moment is this love of annual innovation competitions, and often this comes from an idea inside a leader who are effectively by default organizational designers, maybe a CMO or a CTO or a COO, and they have this idea that money will motivate creativity. And then that money motivating creativity will create, and I'll actually get my pointer up here, will create, means that I go, okay, I really want innovation and money. I think money motivates creativity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run an annual innovation competition. But what we actually find is that annual innovation competition makes people start to save up their ideas, and they store them for the annual innovation competition. And because they're storing their ideas, the focus on creativity starts to drop. And when the focus on creativity starts to drop, our daily innovation starts to drop. And so then they're seeing the daily innovation dropping, and these people going, money motivates creativity. So they decide to put a bigger reward in the pot. And then people want to save ideas even more. And so we create these unvirtuous cycles. And this diagram was just one I quickly knocked up in Loopy, and you can create these beautiful diagrams in Loopy and press play on them and say, let's fire a bit of money motivation into the system. And very, very quickly, we start to see the feedback loop happen around our system. And I highly recommend having a play with Loopy. It's a free little open source tool just to play things. And suddenly we've got no focus on creativity, no daily innovation, and we've got lots of saving ideas and people going, but why isn't this working? Why isn't this working? So obviously that's a very, very simplistic version of that little bit of systems diagramming, but I highly recommend that you all do some kind of causal loop diagramming. Did you guys actually manage to see that, Loopy, when I played it?
Yeah, we did.
Cool, perfect, awesome. And so what better thing could we do? Well, what we could do is we could go to our 9 boxes and we could start asking, is there some kind of intervention in any one of our 9 boxes, in one of our pillars, in one of our levers that might help us get more innovation? We could go, maybe it would growth mindset help. Maybe we could make one of our values a learning value, and we could implement that right up in that top left-hand corner. We could make it fundamental to the whole organization, make our culture based around growth mindset and learning. Maybe we need to create more safe to fail spaces. So we need to get leaders who can create more autonomy and create more trust and spaces where people feel empowered and can fall over. Maybe we learn when we're reading some of the literature and the evidence that that innovation is transient, and that when people think of a great idea, if they can't immediately go to someone and activate that idea and play with it, it often appears to them for seconds, and then they go, oh no, that's going to be too hard to get anything to do about. And suddenly they've forgotten it and it disappeared off into the ether and no one ever remembers it. So maybe the interaction we could have is a system level finance intervention in our organizational structure to make finance really easy to get at for people in our organization, so that when they come up with the idea, they can instantly go get it. Maybe we read about the fact that diversity supports creativity, and creativity is going to be good for our innovation. So maybe we need to do some work on our system level here in the middle, and we need to look at recruitment, or we need to look at our team composition, and we need to figure out how can we work with HR to change the way we bring creativity into the organization in that box. Maybe when we're reading the thing that we realize actually the evidence shows us that creativity and innovation is a teachable skill, which many of you may not have known. And so actually we could create some training, and we could put that in as a people practice, and we could implement some training at the bottom, and that would help people get to think more about how do I innovate, and am I innovating on a daily basis. We can also look at the literature and go, we can see the psychology that when anyone feels any scarcity, even fragmentary scarcity of time or money or space in their day, and that if their cognitive load drops, their cognitive capability and space drops, and they actually score about 20% worse on creativity tests after thinking about a scarcity problem. So maybe we need to make innovation part of our performance assessment so that people don't feel guilty about spending time thinking about it when they're doing it. Or maybe over here, we need to put in some WIP limits so that people have more time in their day, and we need to have time allocation or time sheeting allocation to innovation so that scarcity is not an operating factor in our organization. So all of these things, and you can see that what they come out to is that there are interventions in 5 potential boxes. And we can go, actually, this one, although it sounds really nice and easy, it's probably not going to be, because it's probably going to have, because it might be about time allocation or time sheeting or WIP, it's probably going to create friction with some of these other systems up here. So maybe we should look at prioritizing one of these ones where it's going to have less friction with other systems. It might be harder to work on, but one of these ones, maybe we can find an open-minded leader we could go and have a chat with who's got influence over that system, and we could figure out what we could do over there. And I just started playing with expanding that causal loop diagram to try and think about, if we really were worrying about this intervention, what more things would we worry about that we could go back to the management and show them, if they are going to stay convinced that money motivates, what the potential negative flows might be. But we would also want to do a positive flow version of maybe some alternatives that we could put in front of them and show them the bit of evidence that shows that money doesn't motivate creativity. But you can imagine, if we have an innovation competition, then most people don't win. And so that creates a whole bunch of unhappy people, and that makes some more people leave, and that ups our recruitment costs. And then those people leave and they take other ideas with them because they've been storing them for the last year. So you've just lost another year worth of innovation ideas. Or maybe because people are saving ideas, then when they're at the water cooler, they won't tell each other about those things, and there's more secrets in the organization, which makes for a more unhappy culture. So you can easily start to map out how any kind of organizational design intervention, you have to have this kind of level of thinking about before we consider whether or not we should do it. And I've got 2 or 3 more slides on things to worry about when you're creating interventions, and then we can go to some Q&A, and I can talk about maybe some specific areas that you guys are interested in. But on the no right answer thing, there's this quantum yo-yo problem, which is when you design anything and you send an action off into the blue and drop a stone into the lake of your organization and create ripples everywhere, then that's often going to, like in the loopy firing, it's going to trigger another one, and that's going to come back. And I think of this as sort of, I know, almost the diagrams you see of string theory, but otherwise as quantum yo-yos, that when you fire a yo-yo out into the organization, watch out, it's going to come back and hit you in some form, so be prepared for it. There's also this trade-off dilemma. And that is, if we are thinking about innovation, when we do decide to commit some time and effort to innovation, we're trading off maybe optimization or business as usual or quality or sales right now. And the key is to always be aware that anything you decide to accentuate is going to create cognitive load on your organization, to quote, the team topologies book, and that's going to take away time from your teams doing something else. So make sure that that's really on your path to being an awesome organization. And finally, I guess a note to all of you who are not the CEO of your organization, which is, I'm assuming, most of us. And that is, it's a Russian doll problem, in that every time we look at these 9 boxes, we could look at these 9 boxes for one team, and we can look at what are the organizational dynamics within the team or the teams or the tribe or the alliance or whatever scale of grouping that you manage or influence. You can then try to surface those ideas to progressive leaders who can give you support and help you in making change in the right place, and not just at acting on a practice symptom at the lowest priority place. And you can also use it to be on the lookout for dysfunctions that might be coming from one of those higher priority places and affecting your team in a negative way. And then you can open up a dialogue around that and think about maybe how do we create an umbrella, or how do we interact with that system in a more healthy way. And that might mean taking our next adjacent path very sideways from our great organization, and rather than thumping our brain or our head against the perfect answer that is on the direct path to the great organization, we may have to take a bit of a sideways step. So I've been producing some short free diagnostic tools which allow you to use some of those 110 questions I talked about to get some basic heat maps for your organization. And I'm going to be firing those out on a website very, very soon. And if you're interested in having a go with those tools and seeing what the heat map that comes up for your organization is, then just send me an email at douglas@theadjacent.co, not .com. And I will make sure when that comes out in the next few weeks that I fire it off to you. And remember that as leaders and influencers in your organization, we need to be taking on this organizational design mantra, looking to design for an extraordinary community, looking to design for clear organizational priority and customer needs, and the structure and systems for efficiency and quality all at the same time, and make sure that that's part of our remit and part of our goal. And we put time aside to that every day, because organizational engineers, people who want to organizationally design, they must see the whole system and design for the whole system, not just attack symptoms. So, and finally, organizational engineers are learners, and Corrado asked me to highlight some books. So there's some of my favorite books on the right, and people that you should be reading information from if you didn't like one of the 50 books that I showed pictures of earlier in the presentation. So yeah, that's kind of me.
Thank you, Doug. Wow, what a rush.
Sorry, lots
really
of information, lots of information.
Yeah, really, absolutely.
Shall I exit this?
What do you mean?
Should we stop sharing? Should we do that?
Yeah, sure. We can move to the gallery view. Okay, and any question on all the stuff that Doug has shared tonight?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be sending out the link and making sure that it's out there. I don't know, Corrado, do you want to scan the questions, or should I scan the questions?
Oh, well, I'm just...
or does anyone just want to throw their question out again in a verbal form?
Yeah. The question, are you talking about the question for the book or the questions for...
Oh, anything. Open to the floor. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in this moment we can open our microphone, and eventually, if there are some questions, you can chat if you don't want to talk, but feel free to jumping in.
I have a question, Douglas.
Great.
Hi,
Hey, Catherine.
With your years of experience, what size of the organization do you normally work with or consult on these organization designs?
Well, I recently did, well, recently, it seemed this year has gone so fast. Uh, uh, about 2 years ago, I did diagnostic weeks with Malaysian and Indonesian governments. And so I went in and spent about 7 days with each government, interviewing people from the minister right the way down to the delivery teams at the coalface in those governments across many ministries, just to look at what kinds of things was holding them back as kind of future thinking organizations. So at big scale, I obviously also spent quite a few years with Ocado in the Ocado technology piece, which is was about 1,500 engineers-ish when I left, and across many services and products. And I've worked with some small startups recently with 10 or 20 people. So when I was saying it's a Russian doll problem, the dynamics, those 9 boxes work on pretty much any scale of organization. In fact, they also work on volunteer community groups. We were doing some work with a charity that works on loneliness recently, and we were looking at loneliness in the elderly, and we were able to use some of those things just to look at their community problem.
Okay. So my question is, say for smaller size startups, and quite often with the resource constraint, you will have pretty much a lot of people wearing different hats within the organization, and they don't have a specific role according to the perfect Scrum or Agile, definition. And quite often those startups are made up of people who are quite young, fresh out of university, had an ideas. So they didn't go through these organizations of seeing the different types of agile that's run in a slightly larger environment.
Mm-hmm.
Then how do you go about first how do you go about explaining those things to them? Actually, sometimes things work slightly differently than what they're currently working. Second is, how do you overcome the limitation of budget, the resource limitation that they couldn't really have the budget to hire that many people? Then in that way, then how do you design the organization for everybody working the right role?
So I guess, T-shaped people is a fundamental of Agile, right? The generalizing specialists or specializing generalists, whichever way you want to think of it. And I think that in startups and small organizations, there's just got to be much more of a T-shaped attitude in general, because people have to pitch into different roles. I think the key is, in a very small startup, everyone can collaborate. You can come around the 9 boxes and you can discuss, is this thing that we're thinking of doing in one of these boxes? And we can have a collaborative discussion about that. Are we planning on changing a practice? Is our system aligned with that? And is our leadership strategy and vision aligned with that? And we can check whether or not our HR and our finances align. So the wonders with a startup is getting all of those silos together is much, much easier. And you can have that as an open conversation. And I love to use the 9 boxes to help people go, what are we going to affect? And then let's look at different, because it's multi-finality and equifinality, multiple different ways of solving the same problem. Let's brainstorm 10 ideas up on the board and let's see which box they fit into. And then maybe let's pick the top 2 and do a little systems diagram like I did in Loopy of that idea. And let's brainstorm it together. So it can definitely help to get a facilitator or a coach or one person who's got the kind of deep systems knowledge to help everyone else participate. But it works really well just because you get that kind of general buy-in from everyone in the team.
Okay. And then work from there on, and they come up with some own.
Then obviously you have to design the intervention, and obviously you want to involve as many people as possible. One of the interventions we did at Ocado while I was there was to change the performance management model, and for that we involved volunteers from around our entire organization, and we tried to create conversation with over 1,000 staff.
Yeah.
To make sure that everyone was really bought into that change, because it was going to affect everyone's life.
Yeah. So I guess it will need to be the organizational leader to be aware they need some sort of external advice and intervention in order to them to reach out to you to have a look at the system for them, right? Because some organization might not be in a position to say, hey, there's something, you know, we need to fix that. They might still think, okay, actually we have a delivery issue. Actually, maybe we didn't estimate the points enough. You know, what you're saying is in the lower quadrant.
Absolutely. So often that's the key to the starting of the conversation is to map where it is and go, oh, but there's some effects on that, and why are we working on that?
Yeah.
But yeah, maybe I'll jump to someone else. Thanks for your question,
thank
Catherine.
you.
Hi, Douglas. I've just turned the camera on. I don't know.
Yeah, cool.
Whether you can see me.
Yeah, I can. Hey, Rachel.
Sorry, you've got a little bit of feedback. I'm not too sure why, but I just wanted to say thank you very much for the presentation. It's the first time I've joined this particular meetup. I've made some notes, and I found it quite interesting around those 9 dynamics. So I'm actually part of a senior leadership team in a global company, and I've been introducing quite a lot of change recently. Not only setting up an office of architecture and an architecture and strategy function as part of a wider technology team, but also part of organisational change design team. We've got feedback.
Yeah. Corrado, maybe you could just turn your sound off just in case it's yours. Yeah, cool. Rachel, try that.
Yeah, I think that's better.
Cool.
So it was I'm definitely going to take a read and look a little bit more in detail around your slides, but that diagnostics resonates with the work I'm doing in terms of how you said, you know, how are we doing, and to get a temperature gauge. And what we're actually doing is it's good to liken it to, you know, things you've mentioned is a health check. So we're creating a health check for the architecture offices that I'm setting up, because you mentioned that people element is also really important, and to say, you know, are they feeling valued, or do they feel that they're making a difference? And is it the same people that are coming to present all the time at the architecture council, for example? So yeah, I just thought that was really interesting, listening to your talk, and I think I might, even if I may be able to sort of plagiarize some of your bits, but obviously attribute it to you. But yeah, thank you. Feel
free. We're definitely wanting this kind of thing to get out there. It's part of the thing I believe in, if you will, is that if we're not looking at all of these aspects, and like I said, all models are wrong, so it's just an indicator of the 9 key functions. But what I find that almost all of that literature that I've managed to gather and all of the academia and stuff fits into one of those, and it's reasonably. We've tested it now with a lot of C-level, for instance, and they do understand the 9 boxes. When I tried to show them the early mapping, no one understood it whatsoever. Yeah. No,
definitely you have to look at things holistically, and that's just resonates a lot with the role that I have at the moment, and making sure. So I set up a steer code. I put a very quick note on here, and I know you probably want to take some more questions, but creating a steer code where we've got representatives across those 8 teams of technology, so that everybody can shape the process together, and making sure that we're doing an invite over an inflict approach. So
that works brilliantly, but one of the key things to note here is that you do need someone, obviously that group then need to commit to some systems thinking, and being able to actually try and diagram out the kinds of interventions they're talking about. Yeah. And they may need someone with some psychology background in the room, or with some systems thinking in the room, or with some understanding of flow efficiency and lean paradigms in the room, or even just someone who understands how those things are going to, I guess, interact.
Sorry, it came up on my screen.
We have a poll. Yeah, so I guess the key is making sure that they don't. Often the problem is we don't know what we don't know. And so what I'm trying to highlight with that first layer is access to a huge volume of information, just to help people go, oh, we should check, each of these boxes and check what information is out there. Because if we miss a box and it's one that's vital between us and a system, we could really screw up.
Yeah, and that idea that you said, that you kind of likened it to, I don't know, that elastic band, but it reminded me of Kaplunk. Pull out one straw and look how it affects all the other things.
It's very
anyway,
like that.
I've had
cool.
enough ahead time, but thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else out there got a question?
Yeah, so Douglas, if I can ask a question, thanks anyway for the wonderful presentation. You spoke about if you are working waterfall and you want to make a stretch to, like, you know, scale agile, that doesn't really work. Could you help me out a little bit with how should you then approach that? And just for contextuality, I think our company is using agile in certain parts of the company, so in the delivery parts mainly. But if you look at the support domains, HR, risk, finance, even the portfolio management, the change management, they're actually not. So someone actually sometimes calls this half pregnant.
Yeah.
And I'd love to have your reflection on that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really common pattern, and I feel for you. But and I've been in organizations in that exact state, and by accident in my past, I've effectively accentuated that state. You know, I've been one of the ones creating that ground up swell of agile and competing and creating friction with the surrounding systems. And so a lot of the game, I think, is what I'm trying to move people away from is setting a goal of agile, setting a goal of digital, setting a goal of culture change or something, and saying, let's be realistic about ourselves. We're going to go on an evolutionary journey. Let's not describe the outcome at the end of the evolutionary journey with a framework. Let's describe the goal at the end of the evolutionary journey with maybe the describing in a story form what would it look like, how would teams feel, how would the organization feel, how would we inspire the world around us, or, you know, that kind of vision. And then let's start an evolutionary journey where we do coherent evolution, where we take one small step and we go, okay, let's look at our strongest boxes on the 9 boxes. Let's look at our weakest boxes on the 9 boxes. Let's have a good, frank talk about them. We can either do it by interviewing people and making a judgment from a central facility if we've got the experts, or we can simply, like I showed the post-its, we can map it and go, where are people feeling the most pain? And then let's just do an intervention and tell people about it, keep them involved in it, keep them communicating about it so that they know we care about the evolutionary journey, but that we're going to take it one step at a time and we're going to pick the next maturity layer on one of the boxes to start with. And that's generally what I'm saying. So it's no longer an agile transformation. It's an evolutionary journey where I pick the next thing on the most important space or the lowest hanging fruit and actually get some wins for the organization. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And would you have any practical tips on how to get, for instance, portfolio management along, or change management, who still really thinks in programs and doesn't you showed so much of that innovation in organizational design, and I feel that they sometimes are a little bit scared of that innovative part of organizational working. So
yeah, no, absolutely. So obviously the PMO is designed generally around a project paradigm, yeah, and we know that that's not the end of the maturity scale. Almost everyone here, I'm sure, is well aware of that. So the key is, though, that we've got to figure out if they are a controlling system and some leadership in the organization, then where can we make a next adjacent move with them? And it means doing some really key analysis of what might be one thing that we could shift that they could buy into that would allow them to feel like they were part of the change and part of the design. And you could do a systems design, a systems thinking workshop with them, or draw some causal loops with them. Or otherwise you have to have a very strong leader somewhere in the organization who's willing to make a big jump, and they are always painful for an organization. And they will always, because you're probably going to totally change people's roles, totally change people's livelihoods, and their families are on the line sometimes, and they might lose their job and such like. So it's never pleasant to go into those spaces. ING obviously is a very famous example where they threw everything up in the air, almost fired everyone, and then reset everyone down in new roles. But that's pretty crazy, and it's almost a 10-year journey now, and it was a long, hard struggle, and the commitment from shareholders and board, you can imagine, was horrific. So my recommendation is we have to look for ways to help people join us on a learning journey, see how big organizational design is as a problem, and then get them to join us on designing a little thing. And ideally, if you think that they're going to be a real obstacle in the middle, that PMO, then maybe you need to demonstrate in a safe to fail little experimental place and say, can I borrow this tribe or this team, and can we try a different product focus with them, or user-centered focus with them, or non-project focus, or feature focus? But pick something that's not too much of a radical paradigm jump for them. I'm sorry, that's kind of the... I can talk about some specific PMOs I've dealt with, but it's probably best to do that one-on-one.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. Before the last question at the moment, I would like to share the results of the polls, the 2 polls that I sent while you were answering to the response. Well, the last one was, the question was, will you be able to apply to your organization things discussed here? Well, actually, I can say that 50% of people will be able to do that. So, I mean, it is a very positive response. There is still half of people that are struggling with that. And this is let me say, the part of the work for the future, okay? Previously, I sent a quick feedback, request for a quick feedback about the quality of the speaker. Let me say that actually 97%, Doug, gives you 4 or 5 stars. So I have to say that you really like this. People like this talk. Okay, good. We have time for another question.
Can I go?
Sure, I'm going on.
Absolutely.
Hi, Doug.
Hey, Carlo.
Yeah, it's a good model for discussion, definitely, this one. Thank you. So my question is more about how to prioritize interventions, so more of a cost of delay view, because you hinted to that. Some of the difficult ones, sometimes prohibited ones, are at the top layer, right? Sometimes they're not they're not degrees of freedom we have sometimes even, and some others are easier, faster, and can give the quick wins and provide potentially more result for the effort spent, right? So
I'm not 100%
difficult?
certain that's correct, Carlo, because often you get that yo-yo effect where if you're not aligned with the layers above, then you can put a lot of effort into something that looks easy, but it will die.
Exactly, that's my point. How do you, because some things, say it's a mistake potentially not to go for the big changes, but it is going to be a more difficult struggle to understand what go first than just going for the shape. Go for the first top left.
And so you have to judge it for your organization, and I guess that's maybe part of my plea to statement to the 50% of you who don't feel you could apply it to your organization is, you can take these 9 boxes and you can do a diagnostic with a single team on these, and then you can look for where is our weaknesses and our strengths, and then you can design an intervention with some systems thinking on one team. So but obviously the more value is to go bigger, but when you go bigger in the organization, my advice, Carlo, and you know this, is pick a small experiment with that big system don't try and change the entire big system unless you have to. When I was at Ocado, and Camille, I see, is here, who was there with me during this one, we tried to change performance management. And if you try and change performance management or career paths for people, and it affects their livelihood, and it's going to affect HR model for a bunch of people in your organization, either you do a very small experiment on one team, but now they are treated as a unicorn compared with everyone else, and everyone feels like there's two different worlds, or you do everyone at once, and it's high danger, high risk, because you're changing the criteria on which everyone is evaluated. So that was a really big, scary one for us to do, but we had built some weight with the organization that we could do things in the past before that, and we did get sign off from the CEO and COO and CTO at the time to be able to do that. So yeah.
I'm sorry, I have a follow-up one. So
go for it.
So in terms of interventions, it's like probes in Canadian, so you can actually launch more at once, right? So you can do parallel experiments.
On some things you can do safe to fail probes on many, yeah, absolutely. But on some things you just can't, like evaluating people potentially, or yeah.
No, I was more working more on the how can you actually have more probes running at the same time successfully in your experience.
Absolutely, then it's about mapping them onto the 9 boxes and going, am I overloading this box? Am I totally focusing on the left column, left pillar, and excluding the right one? You know, so if you overload a single place, that place is going to get change fatigue. And if they get change fatigue, then they're going to get grumpy at you. You can do the systems analysis on your own change, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Not so much a question, but just more of a statement of, I'd be really curious to see, hey, how's it going? I'd be really curious to if you had any other examples of, one of these 9 boxes and an intervention and what went right, what went wrong, just as like a learning experience of, where can you misstep and where can you, what are appropriate interventions for this segment of the scheme. That's probably another whole other talk, but
yeah. So obviously there's a lot I can pick from, but the answer is you are always going to misstep. There is no right answer. You are always going to screw it up when you're dealing with such complexity. Yeah, even in a small organization of 10 or 20 people, you are going to screw it up to some extent. There's going to be someone who doesn't align naturally to what you're proposing. Yeah, people don't like change, and that's why there is the adoption curve. So it's kind of like a matter of, the thing I'm trying to push here is that if you follow a well-structured process where you involve as many people as you can, you look at the diagnostics, you check all the 9 boxes, you make sure that you have some understanding of the consequences, and you've done a bit of a systems mapping or a causal loop diagram or something to, as a group, to get some buy-in and then design an intervention, then at least you're on the right track. And then you check it again in a week's time or a year's time, depending on the scale of the thing you're trying. But check it as often as you possibly can. And then at least you've got a chance of succeeding, because people can pivot with you and see whether it's going right or wrong. One of the classics I do see, though, is I'd get teams decide to do something in a retrospective. This is the classic one team problem. You get one agile team and they go have a retrospective at the end of a sprint or something, and they say, let's try, I don't know, changing the way we do story points this sprint. It gets used for like 1 hour in the following 2 weeks. And then at the end of that sprint, they have another retrospective and they say, no, that sucked. Let's not do that again. And you're going, you have one data point. Did you really, for 1 hour, did you really try that thing out? Did you really understand the consequences of it? Yeah. So I do see a key problem of some of these interventions being that people don't commit for long enough and don't really understand the metrics they should look at. They often just go, oh, we're feeling pain, therefore it must be wrong. But you know that there's going to be a J change curve, and it's going to feel some pain in the middle of it. So after one instance, if you're feeling some pain and you instantly reject it, you clearly didn't understand changing complexity. Yeah.
So there's a big part in how you frame the intervention.
Totally. And obviously sometimes at a macro level in an organization, some leader is going to make a big call and go for a big intervention. And they're hugely hard to run, hugely delicate, often take months or years, and they need a really good team behind them to implement them. So
yeah,
but if there are really specific areas, then it's been ages since we've talked, Ed. So feel free to get hold of me, and we'll have a natter about some of your specifics.
Yeah, we'll chat some other time.
Cool.
Thanks for the talk.
Anyone else out there?
Great. The last question? Okay. In the meantime, just to say thanks a lot to Doug for this sharing. I think that this was a great event, actually. As I told you before starting, I had a preview with this, but it's always interesting. Also because what I like it is that this is a very large view. It's not something really close to the daily activity, but it's there is a vision behind that. This is what I like it. And in the chat, you can find the link to the next event next week. We will have another coach actually, but working on something, discussing on something more practical. I mean, the conflict between technology and business in the agile teams. So not a large view as we had tonight, but something for a daily activity, day-by-day activity. Again, keep in touch for the recording video. You have the link to the new YouTube channel, so you can register and you will be notified when the new video will be available. I have already moved the video that were present in the old channel, so you can go there and watch our previous session. We will share the material in the next day, so stay tuned, and thank you, Doug. Wonderful talk, really.
Thank you.
Thank you, and bye.
Have a good night to everyone. See you next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.